Step into a quiet, cold stone room, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and old tapestries. Outside, the Parisian winter air nips at the cobblestone streets. But here, in this chamber of the French royal palace, a different kind of chill has settled. The only light comes from a sputtering candle on a heavy oak table, its flickering flame dancing across the nervous faces of advisors and courtiers. Their eyes are all fixed on one man, a man who sits on a carved wooden throne, his face a mask of weary contemplation. This is King Philip VI of France, and he has just received news from across the English Channel, news that has arrived not in a wave of shouts and banners, but on a simple folded parchment sealed with the unmistakable mark of the English crown. The words on the page are a declaration, not of peace or alliance, but of a claim so audacious it could unravel the very fabric of Europe. The English King, Edward III, is stating in no uncertain terms that he, not Philip, is the rightful king of France. A soft rustle of silk as a hand tightens on a scepter, a barely audible sigh that carries the weight of an entire kingdom's future. How did two men, born to rule separate nations, come to stand on the brink of a century-long war over a single contested throne? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you listening from? What time is it for you? So this story doesn't begin on a battlefield with the clash of steel, but in the quiet, tangled genealogies of medieval royalty. To truly understand the 100 Years' War, you have to go back to the beginning of a simple family tree problem. The French monarchy for centuries had been passed down through the male line, a principle known as Salic law. This law was a cornerstone of their succession, a tradition that had kept the crown within the Capetian dynasty for over 300 years. But then, in the early 14th century, the direct male line of the French royal family, the House of Capet, simply ran out. The last three kings, Louis VI, Philip V, and Charles IV, each died without a male heir to succeed them. Now, you might think this would be a simple case of passing the crown to a sister or a niece, but that's where Salic law comes in, a bit like a royal-sized wrench in the works. The law, as interpreted by the French nobility, meant that a woman could not inherit the throne, nor could a man inherit it through a female line. This created a bit of a sticky situation. When Charles IV, the last of the direct Capetian line, died in 1328, the French nobles had to find a new king. They looked to his closest male relative through a male line, which was his cousin, Philip of Valois. He was a good, solid choice in their eyes, a Frenchman through and through, and he became King Philip VI. Easy peasy, right? Not so fast. Across the English Channel, another man was watching this whole thing unfold with a raised eyebrow. This was Edward III, the King of England, and he had a different perspective on the matter. You see, Edward's mother, Isabella, was the sister of the last three French kings. According to the logic of the time, this made Edward a very close relative indeed, and he believed that his claim to the French throne was in fact stronger than Philip's. Historians still argue whether Edward's claim was a genuine belief or simply a convenient excuse to expand his territory and power. Whatever the case, he was a very ambitious monarch, and the idea of ruling both England and France was probably a little too tempting to resist. For a while, things were mostly quiet. Edward III initially did homage to Philip VI for his French lands, a traditional feudal act that acknowledged Philip as his liege lord for territories like the Duchy of Guyenne, a region in southwestern France. It was a classic, I'm the king, you're the duke, but I'm still the king situation, and it was a fragile peace at best. However, the underlying tension was like a quiet simmer on a stove, waiting for a spark. The spark arrived in 1337 when Philip VI of France declared that Edward had forfeited his claim to Guyenne because he had been giving aid to French rebels. This was the moment the quiet simmering boiled over. Edward III responded by formally rejecting his homage, and crucially, by publicly declaring his claim to the French throne. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore, he was fighting for the crown itself. He adopted the French coat of arms, the famous fleur-de-lis, and added it to his own. It was a very public, very clear statement of intent, and it marked the true beginning of the long, drawn-out conflict. This wasn't just a simple land dispute. It was a clash of feudal rights and royal ambition with deep historical roots. The English and French royal families had been intertwined for centuries. The English kings, since William the Conqueror in 1066, had held lands in France, a legacy of the Norman conquest. This created a constant source of friction, a situation where an English king was simultaneously a sovereign ruler in his own right and a vassal of the French king for his French holdings. It was a geopolitical Gordian knot that was always threatening to come undone. So when the male line of the French throne died out, it wasn't just a succession crisis. It was the moment that this centuries-old tension finally found a singular, powerful outlet for war. The stage was set, the claims were made, and the armies were beginning to stir. As the declaration of war echoed across Europe, the stage was set for a new kind of conflict. It wasn't just a simple knightly duel. This was going to be a long, drawn-out affair, a war of nations. The English and French royal families had been intertwined for centuries, a messy genealogical knot of marriages, inheritances, and feudal obligations that had now snapped. Edward III, with his bold claim to the French throne, wasn't just a disgruntled vassal. He was an ambitious king who saw an opportunity to unite two of Europe's most powerful realms under one crown. Philip VI, on the other hand, was a new king, still trying to solidify his authority, and now he had to face the most direct and dangerous challenge imaginable. The initial phase of the war, from 1337 to around 1340, was a curious and somewhat theatrical affair. Both kings were in a hurry, not to fight, but to gather allies and resources. Diplomacy became the first battlefield. Edward III, in a move that seems a bit like medieval politicking, spent a lot of time and money securing allies in the Low Countries and the Holy Roman Empire. He needed support on the continent to open a second front against France and to secure his supply lines. This was a costly venture, as a lot of these alliances were bought with cold, hard cash. He even made a trip to the Low Countries, and for a short time set up a kind of alternative royal court there, a testament to how seriously he was taking this. Philip VI, meanwhile, was not sitting idly by. He was shoring up his own alliances, particularly with the Scots, who were long-standing rivals of the English. This was a classic "my enemy's enemy is my friend" situation, a strategic move that would keep a significant portion of Edward's military attention fixed on his northern border. You see, the 100 Years' War was never just a simple fight between England and France. It was a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and internal politics that stretched across the entire continent. The first real military clash of the war wasn't on land, but at sea. In June of 1340, the English and French navies met off the coast of Flanders in the Battle of Sluys. The French had assembled a large fleet, a mix of their own ships and Genoese mercenaries, in the harbor of Sluys. Their goal was to prevent Edward from landing his army on the continent and to disrupt English trade. The French fleet was formidable, but their tactics were, shall we say, a bit static. They moored their ships together in tight lines, essentially turning them into large, floating fortresses. This worked well for defense, but it made them incredibly vulnerable to a direct assault, a fact the English were about to exploit. Edward III, who was actually commanding the English fleet in person, approached the French with a mix of cunning and daring. The English ships, many of them converted merchant vessels, were more maneuverable, and their crews were a mix of sailors and soldiers, including a large contingent of their feared longbowmen. The battle itself was a chaotic, bloody affair that was less of a naval battle and more of a series of land battles fought on floating wooden platforms. The English ships would grapple with the French vessels, and then the longbowmen would rain down arrows from above, a truly terrifying sight for the French sailors who were not equipped to deal with this kind of ranged assault. Then, the English men-at-arms would board the ships, fighting hand-to-hand in the confined spaces of the decks. The French fleet was utterly annihilated. Many of their ships were captured, and thousands of French sailors and soldiers were killed, many of them drowning as their ships were sunk. The Battle of Sluys was a monumental victory for the English and a devastating blow for the French. It gave Edward III complete control of the English Channel for the foreseeable future, meaning he could now transport his troops to France whenever and wherever he pleased, a strategic advantage that would last for years. This naval dominance was a key factor in the English success in the early stages of the war. It was also a massive humiliation for Philip VI and his navy. A lot of the French aristocracy and nobility were on board those ships, and their deaths were a significant loss of manpower and prestige. The defeat was so complete that no one even dared to tell Philip the news directly. Instead, they reportedly found a court jester to break the news by telling the king that the English sailors didn't have the guts to jump into the water like the brave Frenchmen. A little dose of dark, medieval humor to lighten the mood, or at least try to. The victory at Sluys gave Edward the momentum he needed, but it also masked a financial reality. The war was incredibly expensive, and Edward was running out of money. His alliances had been costly, and the maintenance of an army and a navy required vast sums. He was already deeply in debt, and he needed a major victory on land to justify the enormous expense and to truly threaten Philip VI. So after Sluys, Edward landed in France with his army, but the anticipated grand battle never happened. Philip VI was a cautious king, and he wasn't going to risk his entire kingdom on a single, decisive fight. He preferred to use a policy of attrition, avoiding direct confrontation and using his numerical superiority to his advantage. This left Edward in a bit of a strategic bind. He had won the sea, but he had yet to win the war, and the slow, grinding nature of the conflict was already proving to be a huge drain on his resources. It was a classic stalemate, a quiet prelude to the much more famous and bloody battles that were yet to come. With the English having secured naval supremacy, the stage was set for the land campaigns to begin in earnest. The initial skirmishes and sieges had been a bit of a mixed bag for Edward III, but he was determined to force a major confrontation. He needed a victory that would not only justify his enormous spending on the war effort, but also legitimize his claim to the French throne in a way that naval battles never could. He decided to lead a large-scale chevauchée, a devastating raid across enemy territory, not to hold land, but to terrorize the French countryside, plunder the wealth, and most importantly, provoke Philip VI into a decisive battle. This was a classic medieval strategy, a calculated move of intimidation and destruction, a way of saying, your king can't protect you. In the summer of 1346, Edward III and his army landed in Normandy, a region with historical ties to the English crown, and began their march. This was not a subtle invasion. They burned villages, sacked towns, and left a trail of chaos in their wake. They even managed to sack the city of Caen, a major hub in Normandy, where they seized a vast amount of plunder. The French were, of course, outraged, and Philip VI was finally compelled to act. He gathered a massive army, far larger than Edward's, and began to chase the English forces. Edward's army was now deep in French territory, and he needed to find a way to cross the Somme River to get to the safety of his allied territories in Flanders. Philip, knowing this, ordered his men to guard all the bridges and fords. It was a classic cat and mouse game, and for a while it looked like Edward's army might be trapped. But Edward, ever the cunning strategist, managed to find an unguarded ford at a place called Blanchetaque, and his army crossed just hours before the French arrived. This was a close call, and it set the stage for the inevitable confrontation. Edward now had to decide where to make his stand. He chose a place near the village of Crécy and Agincourt, a gentle, rising slope with thick woods on either side, perfect for funneling the French charge and protecting his flanks. He meticulously arranged his troops in 3 divisions, or battles, and ordered his men to dismount, a common English tactic that gave their soldiers a more solid defensive position. The real secret weapon, however, was about to be put into action. The English army, while smaller, was composed of 2 key components: the dismounted men-at-arms, who formed the core of the defensive line, and the longbowmen, who were the game changers. The longbow was an English innovation, a weapon of such power and range that it was a truly terrifying force. A trained archer could fire an arrow with enough force to pierce armor at a great distance, and they could do so with an incredible rate of fire. At Crécy, Edward had his longbowmen positioned on the flanks of his men-at-arms, creating a deadly V-shape that would trap the charging French knights in a hail of arrows. The longbowmen had also taken the time to dig small pits in front of their positions, a clever little booby trap for the charging French horses. On August 26th, 1346, the French army arrived, a massive, confident force of knights and men-at-arms. Philip VI, however, was in a bit of a hurry. His army was tired from the long march, and it was late in the day, but the hot-headed French knights, so eager for glory, charged forward without a coordinated plan. Their first attack came from a group of Genoese crossbowmen hired by Philip. However, the English longbowmen were more than a match for them. The longbows had a much faster rate of fire, and the crossbowmen were quickly overwhelmed and scattered, retreating in disarray. The French knights, already angry at the cowardice of the Genoese, charged forward themselves, a thunderous, uncoordinated wave of armored men on horseback. This was exactly what Edward III had been hoping for. Wave after wave of French knights charged uphill, their horses stumbling in the pits, and their armor being struck by the relentless rain of English arrows. The longbowmen, firing from a safe distance, mowed down the French lines. The battlefield became a scene of absolute chaos and carnage. The French knights, their discipline broken, were slaughtered in the thousands. Their heavy armor, which was so good at protecting them in a one-on-one duel, became a liability when they were trapped in a mass of fallen men and horses. They were simply targets. The most tragic story of the day was the death of King John of Bohemia, who, though blind, insisted on being led into the thick of the fighting. His banner, bearing his motto, Ich dien, I serve, was later found next to his body, and it was adopted by Edward, the Black Prince, and has been used by the Prince of Wales ever since. A little bit of historical trivia to brighten the mood. The Battle of Crécy was a rout, an absolute triumph for the English, and a devastating humiliation for the French. Thousands of French nobles, knights, and soldiers were killed, and the French army was shattered. It was the first time that the English longbow had been used on such a large scale, and its effectiveness was a wake-up call to the rest of Europe. The age of the heavily armored knight, who could ride through anything, was coming to an end, and a new age of infantry and ranged weapons was being born. The victory at Crécy didn't end the war, but it fundamentally changed its character. It gave Edward III a massive boost in morale and prestige, and it secured his reputation as a great military commander. It also left the French king in a very precarious position. He had lost his army, his best commanders, and a huge amount of credibility. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had just shifted in a very dramatic and very bloody way. Section 4. After the stunning victory at Crécy, Edward III didn't try to push deeper into France to capture Paris or chase the shattered remnants of Philip VI's army. His goal had never been a total conquest in a single battle. Instead, he turned his attention to a much more strategic prize, the coastal city of Calais. This port city, located on the northern coast of France, was a vital strategic asset. Capturing it would provide the English with a secure year-round base of operations on the continent, a convenient entry and exit point for troops, and a major trading hub. It was a long-term play, a way to establish a foothold that would allow the English to prosecute the war more effectively for years to come. So in September of 1346, Edward's army, fresh off its victory, laid siege to Calais. Now, a medieval siege wasn't a quick affair. It was a test of patience, resources, and will. The English didn't have the heavy siege engines to simply smash down the walls, so they opted for a different strategy, a blockade. They surrounded the city by land, and their newly dominant navy blockaded the harbor by sea, cutting off all supplies. Inside the city, the French governor, Jean de Vienne, and the city's population hunkered down, hoping for a rescue from Philip VI. They knew that their city was a symbol of French resistance, and they were determined to hold out for as long as possible. The Siege of Calais lasted for an excruciating 11 months. The English built a miniature temporary town outside the city walls, complete with a market, housing, and even a church. It was a very English approach to warfare, a bit like setting up a really determined campsite. They settled in for the long haul. Philip VI, meanwhile, was in a very difficult position. His army had been decimated at Crécy, and he was struggling to raise a new one. He tried a few half-hearted attempts to relieve the city, but each time he was met with the very real threat of Edward's army, which was now entrenched in a strong defensive position. He couldn't risk another Crécy, and so the citizens of Calais were left to starve. The food supplies dwindled, and their situation became more and more desperate. They had to resort to eating dogs, cats, and even rats to survive. You get the idea. Things were not going well for them. Finally, in August of 1347, with no hope of relief, the starving citizens of Calais surrendered. Edward III reportedly was furious. The long, drawn-out siege had been a huge drain on his treasury, and he was in a mood for retribution. He demanded that 6 of the city's leading citizens, or burghers, come to him with the keys to the city, barefoot in sackcloth, with ropes around their necks, ready to be executed as a sign of the city's submission and his own power. It was a deeply humiliating demand, a very public way of saying, I won and you lost. The citizens were, of course, devastated. One of the city's wealthiest men, Eustache de Saint-Pierre, nobly volunteered to be the first of the 6. 5 more followed his lead, and they made their way to Edward's camp, ready to face their fate. However, a bit of an unlikely hero intervened. Edward's wife, Philippa of Hainault, who had accompanied her husband on the campaign, was reportedly moved to tears by the sight of these brave men, and she pleaded with her husband for their lives. She was pregnant at the time, and she used this as leverage, telling Edward that if he were to kill these men, it would be a very poor omen for their unborn child. Edward, though a ruthless warrior, was also a devoted husband. He relented, sparing the lives of the 6 burghers and showing a small moment of mercy in an otherwise brutal war. This story has become a legendary part of the history of the war, a small glimmer of humanity in the midst of all the conflict. While some historians debate the exact details of the story, it has endured as a powerful symbol of compassion triumphing over revenge. The capture of Calais was a major victory for the English. It provided them with a strategic gateway to the continent that they would hold for over 200 years. It was a massive psychological blow to the French, who had lost a vital city on their own soil. The war had now entered a new phase. It was no longer just about a king's claim to a throne. It was now about holding territory, about a long, slow grind of sieges and skirmishes. Philip VI was left weakened and humiliated, and Edward III had secured his place as one of the most successful English kings in history. But just as the war was reaching a new, more territorial stage, an entirely new and unexpected enemy was about to arrive on the scene, an enemy that didn't care about kings, claims, or castles, and it would change the course of the 100 Years' War in a way no one could have predicted. With the fall of Calais, Edward III had secured a major strategic victory, but the war, for the moment, was about to take a forced hiatus. Just as the English and French were exhausted from years of fighting, a new, far more devastating force was making its way across Europe. It was a silent enemy, one that moved unseen on the wind and through the very air they breathed. This was the Black Death, a plague of such ferocity that it would reshape the continent and for a time make the squabbles of kings seem insignificant. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by fleas on black rats that had hitched a ride on merchant ships from the east. It landed in the ports of Italy, and from there it spread with frightening speed. Its symptoms were terrifying and unmistakable: fever, chills, and the appearance of painful black swellings, or buboes, in the lymph nodes. Death was often swift and agonizing. There was no cure, and no one understood how it spread. Doctors, priests, and peasants alike were powerless in the face of this invisible horror. It reached France and England in 1348, a silent, unstoppable invasion. The war, for all its blood and destruction, was at least a human-controlled affair. The plague was not. It respected no rank, no wealth, and no battlefield. It struck down kings, queens, and commoners with equal ferocity. The crowded cities and unsanitary conditions of the medieval world became perfect breeding grounds for the disease. It's estimated that the Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Europe, a staggering number that is hard to even comprehend. For a few years, the fighting between England and France almost completely stopped. How could a king raise an army when his entire kingdom was sick and dying? How could he fund a war when the economy was collapsing due to the massive loss of life? The social and economic consequences of the plague were as profound as the human toll. With so many people dead, there was a severe shortage of labor. For the surviving peasants and laborers, this was ironically a time of opportunity. Their skills were suddenly in high demand, and they could now demand higher wages and better working conditions. This shift in the economic balance of power began to chip away at the feudal system, which was based on a large, dependent peasant class. Landowners, on the other hand, were in a very difficult position. Their rents were drying up, and they were struggling to find people to work their land. They tried to pass laws to keep wages low and to prevent peasants from leaving their manors, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The old order was beginning to fray at the edges. In the midst of this chaos, the military campaigns ground to a halt. The Battle of Crécy and the Siege of Calais were still recent memories, but they felt like a world away. The war, which had been a defining feature of the decade, was now a distant second to the all-consuming struggle for survival. The truce that was signed in 1347 which was meant to be a temporary break in the fighting, was repeatedly extended as both countries dealt with the internal devastation caused by the plague. It was a strange and unsettling time of forced peace, with the specter of death hanging over every city, village, and battlefield. The Black Death also had a deep psychological and religious impact. Many people saw the plague as a sign of divine punishment, a grim judgment on a sinful world. The Church, which had been a source of comfort and authority for centuries, was unable to offer a cure or a compelling explanation. This led to a crisis of faith for some and a rise in more extreme forms of religious devotion for others. Flagellants, groups of people who would beat themselves with whips in public to atone for their sins, became a common sight in some parts of Europe. It was a time of immense fear and uncertainty, where the very fabric of society seemed to be coming undone. By the mid-1350s, the worst of the plague had passed, and the populations of both England and France began a slow and painful recovery. But the world they returned to was not the same. The balance of power, both social and economic, had shifted. The war, which had been put on hold, was now ready to resume, but it would be fought by a new generation on a different landscape. The armies would be smaller, the resources would be scarcer, and the psychological scars of the plague would linger for decades. The 100 Years' War was about to enter its next phase, but it would do so in the grim shadow of a global pandemic that had for a time reminded everyone that there were forces far more powerful and terrifying than any king. As Europe slowly began to recover from the nightmare of the Black Death, the simmering conflict between England and France reignited. The first major military action of this new phase of the war would not be led by King Edward III himself, but by his eldest son, a man who would become known to history as Edward the Black Prince. The reason for this new name is a topic of historical debate, but it may have been derived from the color of his armor, a striking and intimidating choice. Edward the Black Prince was a formidable commander, a chip off the old block, and he was determined to prove his worth. In 1356, the Black Prince, who had been holding a court in the English-held Duchy of Gascony in southwestern France, launched a massive chevauchée northwards. This was the same scorched earth tactic his father had used a decade earlier, a terrifying, fast-moving raid meant to plunder the countryside, demoralize the French population, and force the French king into a decisive battle. The Black Prince's army was relatively small, but it was a veteran force, and its core was once again the deadly English longbowmen. They cut a path of destruction through the rich farmlands of central France, collecting a huge amount of plunder and leaving a trail of smoke and ruin. The French king at this time was John II, a very different kind of monarch from his father, Philip II. He was a chivalrous, but perhaps less cautious king who was determined to stop the English raiders. He gathered a large army and set out to intercept the Black Prince. The two forces finally came into contact near the city of Poitiers. The French army, as was often the case, was much larger than the English force, with a numerical advantage of at least 2-1. They had a huge contingent of heavily armored knights, and they were confident that they could crush the smaller English army. The Black Prince, ever the wily strategist, chose his ground carefully. He positioned his army on a hill, with his flanks protected by vineyards and a hedge that was impassable to charging cavalry. In front of his position, he placed his longbowmen in a classic V formation, similar to the one at Crécy. He even ordered some of his men to dismount, a standard English tactic, and to dig small pits to trip up the French horses. It was a well-thought-out defensive position that played to all of the English strengths. John II, on the other hand, made a critical mistake. Instead of using his numerical advantage to outflank the English or simply starve them out with a siege, he decided to launch a direct assault. On September 19th, 1356, the Battle of Poitiers began. It was a mirror image of Crécy, only this time, the outcome was even more shocking. The first French assault was a cavalry charge, but the English longbowmen simply decimated them. The charging knights were hit by a storm of arrows, their horses panicked, and the entire formation fell into disarray. The second French attack was even more disastrous. John II, having seen the failure of the cavalry charge, ordered his men-at-arms to dismount and attack the English on foot. This was a classic tactical error. Heavily armored knights, used to fighting from horseback, were slow and cumbersome on foot, and they were no match for the English soldiers, who were now in a perfect defensive position behind their hedge. The French were repelled again and again, and the battlefield became a scene of absolute chaos. The Black Prince, seeing his opportunity, launched a surprise counterattack with a small group of mounted knights who had been hidden in the woods on the flank. This unexpected charge from the side was the final straw. The French lines, already broken and demoralized, simply collapsed. In the ensuing rout, the most incredible thing happened. King John II of France was captured. A French king, the very symbol of his nation, had been taken prisoner on the field of battle. This was a monumental event, something that had not happened in centuries. A king being held for ransom was not an unheard of thing in medieval Europe, but the capture of a French king by the English was a stunning psychological and political blow. The capture of King John II threw France into a state of absolute chaos. There was no clear line of succession, and the country was left in the hands of the king's young and inexperienced son, the Dauphin Charles. The English, meanwhile, had not only won a massive victory, but they now had the ultimate bargaining chip. They marched their royal prisoner back to England, where he was held in relative comfort, but was nevertheless a captive. The Battle of Poitiers was not just a military victory, it was a political earthquake. It humiliated the French monarchy and left the country in a state of civil unrest and a power vacuum. The war had now entered a new and much more desperate phase for the French, with their king a captive and their future in the hands of a young man who would have to pick up the pieces of a shattered kingdom. With their king, John II, a prisoner in England, France was thrown into a state of political turmoil. The country was left in the hands of the Dauphin, the young and inexperienced Charles V, who would later earn the title the Wise. But for now, he was simply the regent, trying to hold a shattered kingdom together. The English, meanwhile, were capitalizing on their monumental victory at Poitiers. Edward III, with his captive king and his powerful son, the Black Prince, held all the cards. The English were now free to raid and plunder with near impunity. while the French government, lacking a strong central authority, was struggling to respond. The capture of the king created a power vacuum that led to a series of internal crises in France. The nobility was divided, the treasury was empty, and the peasantry was fed up with the endless cycles of war and plunder. This discontent boiled over in 1358 with the Jacquerie, a massive peasant revolt in northern France. The peasants, angered by the heavy taxes, the constant raiding, and the perceived cowardice of their noble lords, rose up in a bloody and brutal rebellion. They attacked castles, killed nobles, and torched villages in a ferocious outburst of class warfare. The revolt was eventually crushed with equal brutality by the French nobility, but it was a clear sign of the deep-seated social problems that were plaguing the kingdom. At the same time, Paris was in the grip of its own political drama. A powerful merchant named Etienne Marcel, who was the head of the city's guilds, seized control of the capital and demanded sweeping reforms. He wanted to limit the power of the monarchy and give more authority to the common people, a truly radical idea for the time. He even tried to ally with the rebellious peasants, but his movement ultimately failed. He was assassinated by a royalist mob, and the Dauphin Charles was able to re-establish his control over the city. These twin crises, the peasant revolt and the Parisian rebellion, showed just how close France came to complete collapse in the wake of Poitiers. Seeing the opportunity to press their advantage, Edward III and the Black Prince launched another major campaign in 1359. This time, their goal was to finally force a resolution. They marched through the French countryside, but they found that the Dauphin Charles had learned a valuable lesson from his father's mistakes. Instead of meeting the English in a pitched battle, he adopted a new, far more effective strategy. He ordered his troops to avoid direct confrontation, to simply retreat into the fortified cities, and to use a scorched earth policy to deny the English army food and supplies. It was a strategy of attrition, a way of saying, "You can't beat me, and you can't conquer my kingdom." The English army, used to winning glorious battles in the open field, was now stuck in a grinding, frustrating campaign. They laid siege to Reims, a city of great symbolic importance as the traditional site of French coronations, but they were unable to take it. The French were simply too well defended, and the English were running out of supplies. The campaign was a failure, and Edward III, realizing that he couldn't win the war by military means alone, finally agreed to negotiate a peace treaty. The result of these negotiations was the Treaty of Brétigny, signed in 1360. This was a major peace agreement that for a time brought an end to the first phase of the 100 Years' War. The terms were, to put it mildly, very favorable to the English. France had to pay an absolutely massive ransom for the release of their king, John II. The amount was set at 3 million gold écus, a sum so large it was almost impossible for the French to pay. To give you an idea of the scale, it was roughly the equivalent of a third of the French national income. The French king himself was released, but his sons were held as hostages until the full amount was paid. In exchange for this ransom, the English gave up their formal claim to the French throne. This might seem like a huge concession, but in reality it wasn't. They instead were granted full sovereignty over a massive swath of French territory, including the Duchy of Aquitaine, the region of Calais, and parts of Normandy. This meant that Edward III would no longer have to perform homage to the French king for these lands. They were now his outright, a very significant legal and political win. The Treaty of Brétigny seemed to have given Edward everything he had ever wanted, a huge ransom and a vast new empire in France. The war seemed to be over, and the English had, for all intents and purposes, won. But as with all things in history, things are rarely so simple, and the peace, as it turned out, would be a very temporary one. The Treaty of Brétigny in 1360 seemed to mark a definitive end to the first, more spectacular phase of the 100 Years' War. The English had won an impressive amount of land and a king's ransom, and they had, at least for the moment, given up their claim to the French throne. But this peace was built on a very fragile foundation. The French, for their part, never fully accepted the humiliating terms. The loss of so much territory and the enormous cost of the ransom was a source of deep national shame. They had lost a great deal, and they were determined to get it back. The man who would lead this quiet, patient, and incredibly successful comeback was none other than the young Dauphin, now crowned King Charles VI. He would earn the title the Wise, not through grand battlefield victories, but through strategic cunning and a deep understanding of the long game. Charles Apiste was a very different kind of king from his chivalrous but impulsive father. He was a bookish, thoughtful man who was more comfortable in the council chamber than on the battlefield. He had learned from the hard lessons of Crécy and Poitiers. He knew that his French knights, in their eagerness for glory, were no match for the disciplined English longbowmen on a pitched field. So he decided to change the rules of the game entirely. His strategy was simple, brilliant, and a complete reversal of the previous French approach. Avoid open battles at all costs. Instead, he would use a policy of attrition, harassment, and siege warfare to slowly but surely chip away at the English-held territories. He began by reorganizing the French army. Instead of relying on a disorganized collection of feudal levies, he began to build a professional, standing army, a force of paid soldiers who were loyal to him, not to a collection of independent lords. He also hired skilled mercenary captains, men like Bertrand du Guesclin, a brilliant Breton knight who would become his most trusted commander. Du Guesclin was a master of guerrilla warfare, and he was the perfect man to lead the French comeback. His motto could have been, "Patience is a virtue," especially when you're facing an army of English longbowmen. He was a master of raids, ambushes, and small-scale skirmishes, a kind of medieval special forces commander. The war unofficially resumed in 1369, and the French began their slow and methodical reconquest. They didn't try to retake all the land at once. They focused on one city or one region at a time. The English, under the command of Edward the Black Prince, were in a very difficult position. They had a vast amount of territory to defend, and their forces were stretched thin. They couldn't be everywhere at once. The French would lay siege to a castle or a town, and the English would be forced to march a great distance to relieve it, only to find the French forces gone by the time they arrived. It was a frustrating and demoralizing process for the English. The English, in a classic display of their old-school mindset, tried to force the French into a decisive battle, just like they had at Crécy and Poitiers. The Black Prince, in particular, was eager for another glorious triumph. He launched a few more chevauchés into French territory, but they had very little effect. The French simply retreated behind their castle walls, and the English were left to raid an already devastated countryside. They would run out of supplies, and they would have to retreat, having gained nothing but a few burned villages. The most famous example of Charles V's new strategy was his methodical reconquest of the territories granted to the English by the Treaty of Brétigny. He didn't just fight, he also used legal and political means. He declared the treaty to be null and void and challenged the English king's claim to sovereignty over these lands. He also used a policy of winning over the local population. The people in these regions, who had been suffering for years under the English rule, were often more than happy to welcome the French back. Many of the local lords and nobles, who had been forced to swear allegiance to the English, now switched sides and rejoined the French cause. This was a war not just of armies, but of hearts and minds, and Charles V was winning on both fronts. By the time of Charles the Pilasser's death in 1380, the French had managed to reclaim almost all of the territory they had lost at the Treaty of Brétigny, with the exception of Calais and a small coastal strip around Bordeaux. It was an incredible comeback, a testament to the power of a long-term, strategic approach. Charles V had shown that a strong, centralized monarchy, using a professional army and a clever strategy, could defeat the seemingly invincible English in their own game. The war was far from over, but the French had, for the first time in decades, gained the upper hand. The English, under a young and inexperienced new king, were about to face a host of their own internal problems, which would only make Charles V's quiet, strategic victories seem even more significant. With the French king, Charles V, having so masterfully reversed the fortunes of the war, the focus now shifted back to the English throne. The Black Prince, the victor of Poitiers, had died a lingering death in 1376, and his father, King Edward III, a shadow of his former self, followed him to the grave just a year later. The crown of England now fell to a child, a boy of 10 years old, the son of the Black Prince, who became King Richard II. This was an immediate and significant advantage for the French. A child king meant a weak, central authority, a court rife with political infighting, and a kingdom that would be more focused on its internal problems than on its overseas war. Richard II's reign was plagued by a series of crises from the very beginning. The first and most significant was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Like the Jacquerie in France, this was an uprising of the common people fueled by economic hardship, high taxes to pay for the war, and a general sense of social injustice. The revolt, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, was a truly terrifying experience for the English nobility. The rebels marched on London, killed a number of high-ranking officials, and even stormed the Tower of London, a major symbol of royal authority. Young Richard II, in a moment of extraordinary bravery, rode out to meet the rebels and promised them an end to serfdom and other major reforms. This act of courage and cunning managed to calm the situation, and the revolt eventually collapsed after its leaders were killed. However, the experience left a deep mark on the young king. He was a king who had to deal with the harsh realities of rebellion and internal strife before he had even reached his majority. While Richard was busy dealing with his internal problems, the war in France continued in a low-key but persistent fashion. The French under Charles VI, who was also a minor at the time, continued their slow and methodical process of reclaiming lost territory. The English, under the command of Richard's uncles, particularly John of Gaunt, launched a number of campaigns, but they were largely ineffective. The French simply refused to engage in a decisive battle, and the English armies would raid, burn, and then be forced to retreat, having accomplished little. The financial cost of these campaigns was enormous, and they were a major source of discontent back home in England. The English public was getting tired of a long, expensive, and seemingly pointless war. Richard II, as he grew older, developed a very different approach to the war than his father and grandfather. He was a man who preferred peace and diplomacy over endless, costly conflict. He was a great patron of the arts and a lover of a lavish court life, and he saw the war as a drain on his kingdom's resources and a threat to his own power. He began to pursue a policy of peace with France, much to the chagrin of many of his nobles, who saw themselves as continuing the glorious tradition of Crécy and Poitiers. In 1396, he made a major step towards peace by marrying Isabella of Valois, the daughter of the French king Charles VI. This was a hugely significant symbolic act, an attempt to solidify a new peace between the two nations. Richard's reign, however, was always a balancing act. He was a king who was constantly struggling with a powerful and often rebellious nobility. His efforts at peace, his attempts to rule in a more centralized autocratic way, and his reliance on a small circle of favorites all alienated the powerful English lords. His decision to seize the lands of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, was the final straw. Henry, who was in exile at the time, returned to England in 1399 with a small army. He was a popular figure, and he quickly gathered support. Richard II, who had lost the support of his own people, was deposed and imprisoned. He would later die in captivity, a tragic end for a king who had tried to end a war his ancestors had started. The crown now passed to Henry Bolingbroke, who became King Henry IV. The end of Richard's reign and the beginning of Henry III's marked a new turning point in the war. The English were now, once again, under the rule of a strong, experienced warrior king who had a direct claim to the throne, not through inheritance, but through conquest. Henry IV, however, spent much of his reign dealing with his own internal problems, including Welsh and Scottish rebellions, and a series of plots against his life. He was a king who was constantly looking over his shoulder, and he didn't have the time, the resources, or the secure power base to resume a major campaign in France. So for a time, the war once again went into a quiet, simmering period, but the peace, as we have seen so many times before, was a very fragile thing, and the long, slow, grinding conflict was just waiting for a new, more ambitious king to light the fuse. While the English throne was consumed by the internal power struggles of the new Lancastrian dynasty, France was also descending into a chaotic and self-destructive period. The French king, Charles VI, had been on the throne since 1380, but his reign was tragically defined by a debilitating mental illness that began to manifest in the early 1390s. He suffered from bouts of madness that left him completely incapacitated, and at times, he didn't even recognize his own family. This created a political vacuum at the very top of the French government, and into that vacuum stepped two powerful and competing factions, a classic recipe for a civil war. The two main factions were the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The Armagnacs were led by the Duke of Orleans, Louis, who was the king's brother and a powerful man in his own right. The Burgundians were led by the king's cousin, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The rivalry between these two men and their families was a bitter and often violent affair. It wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a personal feud, a battle for control of the French government, the royal treasury, and the king himself. Their conflict was like a twisted, medieval version of a family feud with a whole kingdom hanging in the balance. The rivalry started with political squabbles and public insults, but it quickly escalated. In 1407, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, did something that was considered a truly unforgivable act in the medieval world. He had his rival, Louis of Orleans, assassinated in the streets of Paris. This was a direct attack on the royal family, and clear line had been crossed. The murder plunged France into a bloody and brutal civil war that would last for years. The Armagnacs, now led by Louis's son and father-in-law, the Count of Armagnac, swore revenge on the Burgundians. The country was split in two, with different regions, cities, and noble families aligning themselves with one side or the other. It was a time of immense internal strife, where a Frenchman was as likely to be killed by another Frenchman as he was by an Englishman. This internal conflict had a direct and immediate impact on the ongoing war with England. Both sides, in their desperation to gain an advantage, began to look for outside help. The Burgundians, in particular, were not shy about seeking an alliance with the English. John the Fearless, in a move of pure political opportunism, openly negotiated with the English kings, Henry IV, and later his son, Henry I. He offered them military support and recognition in exchange for their help in his struggle against the Armagnacs. This was a classic divide and conquer scenario, and the English were more than happy to play along. The French Civil War was a truly tragic period in the nation's history. It created a situation where the country was bleeding from both its internal wounds and the external pressure from the English. It weakened the French state, made it impossible to present a united front against the English, and created a level of chaos that would have been unimaginable just a few decades earlier. The French government, with its mad king and its warring factions, was simply in no position to fight a successful war against a foreign enemy. This was the exact opposite of what had happened during the reign of Charles V, who had so skillfully unified the nation against the English threat. The English kings, Henry IV and his son, Henry VI, were fully aware of the turmoil in France. They saw the French Civil War not just as a problem for the French, but as a golden opportunity for the English. While Henry IV was too busy dealing with his own domestic rebellions to launch a full-scale invasion, he did use the French Civil War to his advantage. He would occasionally send small forces to aid one side or the other, just enough to keep the conflict going and to prevent the French from uniting against him. It was a clever but cynical strategy. The stage was being set for a new and more ambitious English king to take advantage of this unprecedented French weakness. The long-standing conflict, which had been in a state of low-grade simmering for decades, was about to be reignited by a new, more dynamic English king who would see the French Civil War as a gift from Providence itself. The next great chapter of the war, marked by some of its most famous battles, was about to begin. With France in the grip of a vicious civil war, a new, far more ambitious English king ascended to the throne in 1413. This was Henry VIII, a man who was, in many ways, the culmination of all the English kings who had come before him. He was a skilled administrator, a devoutly religious man, and a brilliant military commander with an almost superhuman level of self-control. He was the kind of king who could look at the chaos in France and not see a tragedy, but a divinely ordained opportunity. His first move as king was to reassert the old, long-dormant claim to the French throne. This wasn't just a political move, it was a psychological one, a way of signaling to everyone, both in England and France, that the war was back on and that he was serious. Henry VIII was a master of public relations, and he knew that to get the support of his people and his parliament for a new, expensive war, he needed a very good reason. So he framed his claim to the French throne as a matter of God-given right and justice. He sent a delegation to France to demand not only the lands that had been given to the English by the Treaty of Brétigny, but also a massive dowry for his marriage to the French princess, Catherine of Valois, which he claimed was rightfully owed to him. The French, of course, rejected these outrageous demands, and this gave Henry the perfect justification for war. He could now present himself as a king who had tried for peace but had been forced into a righteous conflict by the stubborn and unjust French. This was a very different kind of war than the ones his ancestors had fought. Henry VIII wasn't just raiding for plunder. He was fighting to be king of France. He was methodical and strategic in his preparations. He rebuilt his navy, he raised a large and professional army, and he secured the necessary funding from his parliament. He was not going to make the same mistakes that had plagued the English campaigns of the past. He was going to hit the French where it hurt, in their heartland, and he was going to do it with a level of planning and precision that was unheard of in the medieval period. The French, meanwhile, were completely unprepared for this new threat. They were still embroiled in their civil war, a conflict that had only intensified since the assassination of the Duke of Orleans. The two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, were more interested in fighting each other than in fighting the English. The French king, Charles VI, was still suffering from his bouts of madness, and the government was in a state of chaos. The French nobility, in a moment of extraordinary and tragic short-sightedness, completely underestimated the threat posed by Henry V. They saw him as just another English king, and they believed that a few minor skirmishes would be enough to make him go away. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. In August of 1415, Henry VI and his army landed in Normandy. This was a direct invasion, not a raid. His first target was the port city of Harfleur. Capturing it would provide him with a secure base of operations and a gateway into the heart of France. The Siege of Harfleur was a long and brutal affair. The French defenders, though outnumbered, were determined, and the city's walls were formidable. The English army, for its part, was hit hard by an outbreak of dysentery, a truly miserable disease that spread quickly through the unsanitary conditions of a medieval camp. Henry V himself was reportedly sick with the disease, but he pressed on. The siege lasted for over a month, a huge drain on English resources and manpower. But finally, in September, the city surrendered. The English had won, but it had been a costly victory. Their army was now exhausted, sick, and depleted. A decision had to be made. Should they go back to England, or should they press on? Henry VI, in a display of his almost fanatical determination, decided to march his army through French territory to the English-held city of Calais. It was a risky and dangerous move, a long march through enemy territory with a sick and tired army. It was a bit like a medieval version of a marathon, only with armored men and the constant threat of a massive French army that was now, finally, gathering to intercept them. This march, born out of necessity and a certain degree of kingly stubbornness, was about to lead to one of the most famous and improbable battles in all of military history. The stage was set for Agincourt, and the French, in their arrogance, were about to walk into a trap of their own making. After the costly siege of Harfleur, Henry I's army was a shadow of its former self. Stricken with dysentery and depleted by the month-long siege, his force of roughly 9,000 men was in a very precarious position. Instead of turning back to England, Henry made the audacious decision to march his army overland to the English-held port of Calais. It was a long, dangerous march of over 200 miles through hostile territory, and the French, finally spurred into action, were determined to stop him. They gathered a massive army, estimated to be at least 20,000 strong, and they were confident that they could trap and annihilate the English king. The two armies finally came face to face near the village of Agincourt. Henry once again chose his ground with a commander's eye for detail. He positioned his smaller army in a narrow gap between two dense woods, a perfect defensive bottleneck that would neutralize the French's overwhelming numerical superiority. The ground was a freshly plowed field, and recent rains had turned it into a thick, muddy quagmire. This was a stroke of luck for the English. The heavy French knights, burdened by their armor, would find it incredibly difficult to maneuver and fight in the thick mud. The English army was a disciplined and experienced force, with a corps of professional soldiers, and once again, the fearsome longbowmen. Henry V, in a display of his personal courage and leadership, chose to fight on foot with his men, dressed in simple but very symbolic royal armor. He gave a rousing speech to his troops, a classic pre-battle pep talk, a version of which was famously written down by William Shakespeare centuries later. He reminded them of their duty, their bravery, and their cause. He told them that though they were few, they were the few, the happy few, we band of brothers. It was a truly cinematic moment that for a few hours transformed a muddy field in France into a stage for history. On the morning of October 25th, 1415, the Battle of Agincourt began. The French, despite their huge advantage, were overconfident and disorganized. They launched a series of charges that were, to put it mildly, a tactical disaster. The heavily armored French knights, eager for glory, charged forward in a tight mass, but they were immediately hit by a storm of English arrows. The longbowmen, firing from a safe distance, rained down a continuous hail of arrows that fell on the French like a deadly sleet storm. The French knights, weighed down by their armor, stumbled in the mud, and as more and more men were killed, they simply piled up on top of one another. The bottleneck Henry had created worked perfectly, and the French charge devolved into a panicked, suffocating mess of men and horses. The English longbowmen, seeing their chance, dropped their bows and charged forward with knives and axes, a truly terrifying sight for the French, who were now trapped in the mud and unable to fight back effectively. The carnage was immense and almost one-sided. The English men-at-arms then joined the fray, and the battle became a brutal, hand-to-hand slaughter. The French forces, who were expecting a glorious victory, were instead met with a humiliating and devastating defeat. The most shocking part of the battle was the slaughter of the French prisoners. Henry, in a moment of panic, feared that the French would rally and attack him from the rear. He gave a controversial order to kill all the French prisoners, many of them high-ranking nobles who could have been held for ransom. It was a ruthless but strategically sound decision that saved his army from being trapped between two French forces. The victory at Agincourt was a military miracle. The English had won against overwhelming odds, and the French nobility had been decimated. Thousands of French nobles, knights, and soldiers were killed, including many of the most prominent leaders of the Armagnac faction. This had an immediate and profound impact on the French Civil War. With so many of their leaders dead, the Armagnacs were now in a much weaker position, and the Burgundians, under John the Fearless, were now the dominant power in France. Henry V, meanwhile, had solidified his reputation as a great military commander and a true king. He had not only won a battle, he had won the psychological war. The English now saw him as a divinely chosen king, a true successor to Edward III and the Black Prince. The French were in a state of shock, their military might shattered, and their government in complete disarray. The victory at Agincourt didn't end the war, but it completely changed its trajectory. The English were now in a position of overwhelming strength, and the French, in their internal strife and national humiliation, were now ripe for the taking. Following the miraculous victory at Agincourt, Henry VI did not immediately press his advantage. He returned to England a hero, and the French, in their grief and chaos, were in no position to stop him. The French Civil War, which had been simmering for years, now boiled over into outright anarchy. The deaths of so many Armagnac leaders at Agincourt had completely changed the balance of power, leaving the Burgundians in a position of dominance. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, now held court in Paris, and he was the de facto ruler of France. The Dauphin, the young and powerless son of the Mad King, was forced to flee south, a king without a kingdom. The years from 1417 to 1419 saw a methodical and ruthless campaign of conquest by Henry VI. He didn't rush this time. He took his time and conquered the key strongholds in Normandy one by one. This was a classic medieval war of sieges and attrition, not a series of glorious battles. He laid siege to cities like Caen, Rouen, and Gisors, and one by one they fell. The French, divided and distracted by their internal strife, were unable to mount a coordinated defense. The English army was a professional force, well supplied and disciplined, and they were relentless. It was a very different kind of war than the one his ancestors had fought. This was about holding land, not just raiding it, and Henry V was a master of it. Meanwhile, the situation in France was reaching a crisis point. The Dauphin Charles and the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, were at loggerheads. The Dauphin, who was an Armagnac sympathizer, was trying to rally support to retake Paris and unite France against the English threat. In 1419, the two rivals, in a moment of desperate negotiation, agreed to meet on a bridge at Montereau to sign a peace treaty. It was meant to be a moment of reconciliation, a chance to end the Civil War and finally focus on the English. But history, as we know, can be a very cruel thing. The meeting was a disaster. During the tense negotiations, one of the Dauphin's men, either in a fit of rage or on the Dauphin's orders, struck and killed John the Fearless. It was an assassination that in a single moment sealed the fate of France. The assassination of John the Fearless was a monumental blunder. His son, Philip the Good, was now the Duke of Burgundy, and he was an even more powerful and influential figure. He was outraged by his father's murder, and he immediately blamed the Dauphin. In a stunning reversal of alliances, he decided to completely abandon the French cause and formally ally himself with Henry V. He signed the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a document that would change the course of the 100 Years' War and European history forever. The Treaty of Troyes was, to put it simply, a complete and total humiliation for the French. Its terms were incredibly favorable to the English. In this treaty, the mad French king, Charles VI, disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, and declared Henry V to be his heir and regent of France. Henry VI was to marry Catherine of Valois, the French princess, thus uniting the two royal families. The idea was to create a new, dual monarchy, with a single king ruling over both England and France. From a legal and political standpoint, Henry V had won. He had, at least on paper, been made the future king of France, a stunning achievement that even his great-grandfather, Edward III, had never been able to accomplish. The Dauphin Charles, of course, was having none of it. He and his small band of followers retreated to the south of France, where they set up a kind of alternative government. They were a pathetic and desperate little court, clinging to a sliver of land that the English had not yet bothered to conquer. They were dismissed as the King of Bourges, a reference to the city where the Dauphin had set up his court, a backwater compared to the grandeur of Paris. The French, for their part, were now divided more than ever. The north and west of France, under the control of the English and the Burgundians, accepted Henry V as their future king. The south, meanwhile, remained loyal to the disinherited Dauphin. The war was no longer just a conflict between England and France. It was now a war for the very soul of the French nation, a civil war that had now been complicated by a powerful foreign invader. The Treaty of Troyes had created a bizarre and unprecedented situation, a dual monarchy with a single ruler. But this grand plan was built on a very fragile foundation, and it began to unravel almost immediately. Both Henry V of England and the mad French king Charles VI died in 1422, just 2 years after the treaty was signed. Their deaths left the throne of both England and France to a single, very vulnerable heir, the infant son of Henry VI, a boy of less than a year old, who was now known as Henry VI. The death of the two kings created a complex and challenging situation for the English. While Henry V's claim to the French throne was now legally and politically cemented by the Treaty of Troyes, his son was an infant. This meant that the real power rested with a regency council, and the day-to-day administration of both kingdoms was in the hands of Henry's two brothers, the Duke of Bedford and the Duke of Gloucester. The Duke of Bedford, a very capable and experienced commander, was made the regent of France, and he was the de facto ruler of the English-controlled territories. He was tasked with the immense challenge of holding on to a vast amount of French land and of suppressing the French resistance that was still active in the south. The French, meanwhile, were in a state of deep division. The Dauphin, now a young man in his late teens, was a king without a crown. He was a weak and indecisive figure, and he and his small court of followers were holed up in the city of Bourges. They controlled only a small portion of the kingdom, mostly in the south, and they were constantly under pressure from the English and their Burgundian allies. His power was so diminished that the English and Burgundians mockingly referred to him as the King of Bourges. His cause seemed hopeless. He had been disinherited by his own father, and he had been blamed for the assassination of the Duke of Burgundy. His own mother, the Queen of France, even sided with the English. The French people in the English-held territories saw the English as the legitimate rulers, and the Dauphin seemed to be nothing more than a desperate figure clinging to a lost cause. The French royal court in the south was a sad and dispirited place. The Dauphin was surrounded by squabbling advisors and was constantly short of money and resources. He was not a natural leader, and he seemed to lack the will to fight for his own kingdom. It was a classic no king, no country situation. The English, for their part, were methodical in their campaign to conquer the rest of France. They laid siege to a number of strategic cities, and they were slowly but surely pushing south. They were confident that it was only a matter of time before the Dauphin's cause collapsed completely, and the entire country fell under the English banner. The English strategy was a textbook example of how to win a war of attrition. They weren't seeking another grand battle like Agincourt. They were winning the war one siege, one town, and one castle at a time. The French, meanwhile, were unable to respond effectively. They were too divided, and their resources were too depleted to mount a full-scale counterattack. The war had now entered a long and grinding phase, a quiet continuation of the same conflict, but with a new and tragic dimension. It was no longer a war between two great kings, but a war between a powerful, well-organized English regency and a weak, isolated French pretender. The odds seem to be completely in the favor of the English. But as we have seen so many times in this story, things are rarely so simple, and the story of the 100 Years' War was about to take a dramatic and completely unexpected turn. A young, unknown girl was about to step onto the stage of history, and with her, she would bring a renewed sense of hope and a new reason to fight for a French cause that everyone else had given up on. The year 1428 found the French cause at its lowest point. The Dauphin Charles, still the uncrowned king, was a weak and indecisive figure, and his court in the southern city of Bourges was a hotbed of political infighting and despair. The English, in a show of force, had begun a major new campaign, and their primary objective was the city of Orleans. This city, located on the Loire River, was the last major stronghold in northern France that remained loyal to the Dauphin. If it fell, the English would have a clear path to the south, and the French cause would, for all intents and purposes, be lost. The Siege of Orleans began in October of 1428, and it was a classic war of attrition. The English, under the brilliant command of the Earl of Salisbury, and later the Earl of Suffolk, built a series of fortified outposts, or bastions, around the city to starve it into submission. The situation inside Orleans was desperate. The French defenders, led by a number of brave but dispirited captains, were running out of food, supplies, and most importantly, hope. They had been fighting for months, and they knew that the English were not going to give up. The Dauphin, meanwhile, was in a state of paralysis. He had no army to send to relieve the city, and he was struggling to raise the funds to even pay his remaining soldiers. It seemed as if the long, grinding war was finally coming to a close, and the English were about to achieve their long-held goal of total victory. But just as the French cause seemed to be on the verge of total collapse, a truly remarkable and completely unexpected figure entered the story. Her name was Joan of Arc. She was a simple peasant girl from a small village in northeastern France, a place that had been hit hard by the English raiding parties. She was illiterate and had no military experience, and yet she was about to do something that no king or commander had been able to do for decades. She was about to turn the tide of the entire war. She claimed that she had been receiving divine visions from God and from a number of saints who had given her a mission to save France by lifting the siege of Orleans and by leading the Dauphin to be crowned at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. Now you might be thinking, a teenage peasant girl leading an army? That sounds a little bit unbelievable, and you would be right. But remember, this was the medieval world, a world where faith and superstition were a part of everyday life. The Dauphin's court was understandably skeptical. They put her through a series of tests, including a theological examination by a number of respected clergymen. But her passion, her faith, and her unwavering belief in her mission were so compelling that she managed to convince them. They were, after all, desperate. What did they have to lose? In February of 1429, Joan of Arc, dressed in a custom-made suit of white armor, was given a small army to lead to Orleans. She was a magnetic and charismatic figure, and her presence had an immediate and profound effect on the French soldiers. They had been fighting for a king who seemed to have given up on them, but now they were fighting for a cause, for a divinely ordained mission. They were no longer just a collection of dispirited mercenaries. They were now an army of the faithful. The story of Joan of Arc and the Siege of Orleans is one of the most famous in military history. She arrived at the city in April of 1429, and her presence immediately electrified the defenders. She was a fearless and inspiring leader, and she was always at the front of the fighting, carrying a banner with the image of Jesus and the fleur-de-lis of France. The English, for their part, were completely flummoxed. They had been fighting a war of logic and strategy, and now they were facing an enemy who was fighting with faith and divine inspiration. It was a new and very unsettling development for them. Joan's arrival turned the war from a military conflict into a spiritual one, a holy war for the soul of France. Joan of Arc's arrival at Orleans was a turning point of not just the war, but of a nation's spirit. She had arrived in a city that was on the brink of surrender, but she brought with her something far more powerful than an army. She brought faith. The French soldiers and citizens, who had been fighting a long losing war of attrition, now believed that God was on their side. This was not a small thing in the medieval world. It was a complete psychological and spiritual shift, and it was the one thing the English could not counter with their longbows or their siege engines. The Siege of Orleans, which had been a methodical and patient affair, was about to become a desperate and chaotic fight. Joan's first act was to lead a small force of French soldiers into the city, carrying supplies and a much-needed dose of morale. She was a fearless leader, and she was always at the front of the fighting, her banner held high. She led a series of counterattacks against the English bastions, and the French soldiers, inspired by her courage, fought with a renewed sense of purpose. The English, for their part, were utterly bewildered. They had been fighting a rational war, but now they were facing what they saw as a kind of divine madness. They couldn't believe that a peasant girl was leading the charge, and they began to question their own cause. The fact that the English had laid siege to Orleans for 6 months without success, and that Joan was able to lift it in just a few days, was a powerful sign to both sides. The most famous moment of the siege came on May 7th, 1429. The English held a formidable position in a fortified gatehouse known as the Tourelle, which was at the end of a bridge over the Loire River. This position was the key to the entire siege. If the French could capture it, the English would be forced to retreat. Joan of Arc led the French charge, but the initial assault was repelled, and she was hit in the shoulder by an English arrow. The French, seeing their new leader fall, were ready to retreat, but Joan, in a remarkable act of courage, pulled the arrow out and returned to the front. The sight of her, wounded but still fighting, inspired the French to a final, desperate charge. The English, who had been fighting for hours, were now exhausted and demoralized. They broke and ran, and the French captured the Tourelle. The next day, the English commanders, seeing that their position was now untenable, lifted the siege and retreated. The lifting of the Siege of Orleans was a monumental victory for the French. It was the first major French victory in a long, long time, and it was a complete and total humiliation for the English. It was a true turning point in the war. The English, who had seemed invincible just a few months earlier, now seemed to be on the defensive. But Joan's mission was not yet complete. She had promised to lead the Dauphin to Reims to be crowned, and she was determined to fulfill that promise. The march to Reims was an audacious and risky undertaking. The city was deep in English and Burgundian-held territory, and the Dauphin and his advisors were reluctant to risk a confrontation. But Joan was unwavering in her conviction, and she convinced the Dauphin to make the journey. The French army, with Joan at its head, marched through enemy territory, but instead of fighting, they were met with a series of surrenders. The English and Burgundian garrisons, disheartened by the loss of Orléans and in awe of Joan's reputation, simply opened their gates and allowed the French to pass. It was a spiritual and political victory that was just as important as the military ones. The French were no longer just fighting for a piece of land. They were fighting for the soul of their nation. The march culminated in the coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429. This was the moment that Joan had been fighting for. The Dauphin, who had been a king in name only, was now the anointed king of France, a ruler legitimized by God and tradition. Joan of Arc stood proudly by his side, her banner held high. The coronation gave the French cause a new kind of legitimacy that the Treaty of Troyes had been unable to take away. The war was far from over, but the French now had a true king to fight for, a sense of national purpose, and a truly inspirational leader. The English, for their part, had just watched their grand plan of a dual monarchy begin to fall apart, and it was all because of a teenage girl with a mission from God. After the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, the French cause was on the rise, but it was far from a total victory. The English and Burgundian alliance still held most of northern France, including the key city of Paris, and they were not about to give up without a fight. Joan of Arc, the hero of Orléans and the force behind the coronation, was now the most famous person in France, a true celebrity in an age of kings and knights. But her celebrity also made her a target, and the English and their allies were determined to get rid of her. The French campaign following the coronation was a bit of a mixed bag. The French tried to capitalize on their momentum by launching a series of attacks on English-held towns, but they were often met with stiff resistance. The attack on Paris, in particular, was a complete failure. Joan of Arc, in her characteristic bravery, led the charge, but she was wounded in the leg, and the French were repelled. The failure to take Paris was a major setback for the French and a huge psychological victory for the English, who could now claim that Joan's luck had run out. The French king, Charles VII, was also beginning to pull back from his reliance on Joan. He was a very different kind of person, a political realist who was more interested in long-term strategy and diplomacy than in the kind of high-stakes, all-or-nothing campaigns that Joan favored. He had used her to secure his throne, but now he was beginning to see her as a liability. She was a peasant girl who was a bit of a loose cannon, and she had a direct line to God that he, the king, did not have. This was a very dangerous thing for a monarch, a bit like having a powerful, popular politician who doesn't answer to you. The court advisors, who were envious of her fame and influence, were also turning against her. They whispered in the king's ear that her time had passed and that they should return to a more traditional, methodical approach to warfare. The tragic end to Joan of Arc's story began in May of 1430 when she was captured by a pro-Burgundian force while defending the town of Compiègne. This was a huge blow to the French cause and a major victory for the English and their allies. The Burgundians, seeing an opportunity to get rid of a powerful and popular enemy, decided to sell her to the English. The English, for their part, were overjoyed. They believed that by putting her on trial and proving that she was a heretic and a witch, they could not only get rid of her, but also completely discredit the French king, Charles VII, whose legitimacy was so closely tied to her. If she was a servant of the devil, then her coronation of Charles was a sham, and the English king, Henry VI, was the true king of France. The trial of Joan of Arc was a political and religious show trial from the very beginning. It was held in Rouen, an English-controlled city in Normandy, and the presiding judge was Pierre Cochon, a pro-English bishop who was determined to find her guilty. The trial lasted for months, and Joan was subjected to a barrage of questions about her visions, her cross-dressing, and her military campaigns. She was a simple, uneducated peasant girl, but she was remarkably clever and defiant in her answers. She refused to renounce her visions and her belief that she was doing God's work. The trial records, which have survived, are a remarkable testament to her courage and her unwavering faith. Finally, in May of 1431, Joan was found guilty of heresy and was sentenced to be burned at the stake. She was publicly executed in the marketplace of Rouen, a very public and brutal way of saying to the French people that their hero was a fraud. The English, and many of the French who had sided with them, breathed a sigh of relief. They believed that they had finally discredited her and the French king she had put on the throne, but they were, in fact, completely wrong. The executions of Joan of Arc turned her from a charismatic military leader into a martyr and a national saint. Her death solidified her place in French history and only strengthened the resolve of the French people to fight for their king. The English had managed to kill the woman, but they had created a legend, and a legend, as we know, is much harder to defeat. The execution of Joan of Arc, intended to be a final public humiliation for the French, had the exact opposite effect. It turned a military leader into a martyr and a symbol of French resistance. But while the French were now fighting with a new sense of purpose, they still lacked a strong united front. The Burgundian-English alliance, which had been so critical to Henry III's success, was still a major force to be reckoned with. The Duke of Bedford, the English regent in France, was a capable administrator, and he was determined to hold on to the vast territories the English had won. He even had the young English king, Henry VI, crowned King of France in Paris in 1431, a symbolic act meant to counter the French coronation of Charles VII at Reims. The war had now entered a long and grinding phase of low-level conflict. The English and Burgundians held a huge swath of territory, but they were constantly harassed by the French. The French, meanwhile, were unable to mount a full-scale assault on the English-held territories. It was a stalemate, a slow, patient game of attrition, and the man who was winning this game was King Charles VII of France. He had learned from his past mistakes, and he was now a more decisive and confident leader. He had shed his former image as the King of Bourges and was now determined to reclaim his kingdom. He used a combination of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering to chip away at the English position. The most important diplomatic event of this period was the Congress of Arras in 1435. This was a major peace conference held in the city of Arras, a Burgundian-controlled city. It was attended by representatives from England, France, and Burgundy, and it was the first real attempt to end the long and brutal war. The French king, Charles VII, was willing to make a number of concessions to the English, including a large sum of money and the promise to hold a number of lands in France as a vassal of the English king. But the English, in a show of arrogance and overconfidence, refused these terms. They still believed that they could win the war outright, and they would not give up their claim to the French throne. This was a monumental blunder on their part. The real prize of the Congress of Arras was not a peace treaty with England, but a reconciliation with Burgundy. The French king and the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had a long and bloody history, and the Duke was still bitter about the assassination of his father, John the Fearless. But Charles VII was a cunning diplomat, and he was able to convince the Duke that their shared French heritage was more important than their personal feud. The Duke of Burgundy, for his part, was also growing tired of his English allies. They had been in control of Paris for years, and they were treating him more like a subordinate than a partner. He was also beginning to realize that the English were never going to be able to hold on to their vast French empire, and he wanted to be on the winning side. The two men signed the Treaty of Arras, a secret agreement that formalized a peace between them. The Duke of Burgundy acknowledged Charles VII as the true King of France, and in exchange, he was given a number of new territories and was permanently exempted from having to do homage to the French king for his lands. This was a huge deal. It meant that the French Civil War was now officially over, and the French king, Charles VII, was now in a position of strength. The English, in their arrogance, had lost their most important and powerful ally, and they were now all alone in France. The Burgundian defection was a game changer. It was the moment that the English position in France began to unravel for good. The English, in a fit of rage and disbelief, declared the Duke of Burgundy to be a traitor, but it was too late. The French, now united, were able to turn their full attention to driving the English out of France. The loss of Burgundy was not just a military setback, it was a psychological and political one as well. The English no longer had a powerful French ally to help them hold on to their territories, and the French people, who had been divided for so long, were now united behind a single king. The war was far from over, but the momentum had now shifted completely, and the long, slow, grinding process of driving the English out of France was about to begin in earnest. With the French-Burgundian alliance now a reality, King Charles VII was finally in a position to push the English out of his kingdom. He was no longer the desperate King of Bourges, but the leader of a unified and determined nation. But he knew that to win the war, he couldn't just rely on military force. He needed a new kind of army, a professional one that was loyal to him, and he needed a new way to pay for it. The French army, for decades, had been a patchwork of feudal levies and unreliable mercenaries. They were good at raiding and fighting in small groups, but they were no match for the disciplined English longbowmen in a pitched battle. So Charles VII, a man who had learned from the mistakes of his father and grandfather, began a series of sweeping military and financial reforms that would change the course of the war. The most important of these was the creation of the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, a professional standing army that was paid for by the crown, not by the individual lords. This was a radical idea for the time. It meant that the king no longer had to rely on the whims of his nobility to raise an army. He now had a permanent, well-trained force that was always ready to fight. These companies were composed of highly skilled professional soldiers, including a large number of archers and mounted men-at-arms. Charles also began to standardize the training and equipment of his soldiers, creating a more uniform and effective fighting force. He even hired skilled commanders who had learned from the English, a bit like a sports team hiring a rival's coach to learn their secrets. To pay for this new, expensive army, Charles VII needed a steady and reliable source of income. He began to reform the French tax system, creating a more centralized and efficient way of collecting money from the cities and the countryside. The French people, who had been suffering from years of war and chaos, were more than willing to pay these new taxes because they knew that the money was going towards a professional army that would finally drive the English out of France and bring peace to their land. It was a classic you get what you pay for situation, and the French were now paying for a winning army. The English, meanwhile, were facing a host of their own problems. Their king, Henry VI, was a weak and ineffective ruler. He was a devoutly religious and peaceful man, which would have been a great thing in a time of peace, but it was a disaster in a time of war. He was a man who was more interested in building chapels than in leading armies. His government was in a state of chaos, with different factions and powerful noble families vying for control. The English treasury was empty, and the government was struggling to raise the money to pay for the war in France. Their vast French empire was becoming a huge financial and military drain, and the English people were growing tired of it. This period, from the late 1430s to the 1440s, was a time of slow but steady French reconquest. The French were no longer fighting a war of pitched battles. They were fighting a war of sieges and attrition. They would lay siege to a town, and with their newly organized and professional army, they would take it. The English, under their disorganized leadership, were unable to respond effectively. They would send a few men to relieve a siege, but they were often too little, too late. The French even managed to retake Paris in 1436, a huge symbolic victory that was a clear sign that the tide had turned. The English regent, the Duke of Bedford, had died a year earlier, and with him went the last English leader who had the skill and the vision to hold on to the French territories. Charles VII's reforms were a quiet and unspectacular victory, but they were just as important as the more famous battles. He had not only unified France politically with the Treaty of Arras, but he had also unified it militarily and financially. He had created a new, modern state, a centralized monarchy with a professional army that was now capable of defeating the English. The stage was set for the final, more rapid phase of the war, a phase that would see the French, who had been on the verge of total collapse just a few decades earlier, now push the English completely out of France and bring a final and definitive end to the long, grinding conflict. The war, as it turned out, was not won by one single battle or one single leader, but by a long, slow process of reform, patience, and good old-fashioned strategy. With the French now united under King Charles VII and his professional army, the English position in France began a slow but inexorable decline. The years between 1444 and 1449 were marked by a truce, a temporary peace that was brokered by the French. It was a brilliant diplomatic move on their part. The English, under their weak and indecisive king, Henry VI, were more than happy to agree to a period of rest. The French, however, used this time very differently. While the English regency was busy with its internal squabbles and its empty treasury, Charles VII was putting his newly reformed kingdom to the test. This period of peace was for the French a time of quiet preparation, a way to test their new army and to make sure that they were ready for the final push. It was a classic example of a nation using a truce to its own advantage, a very un-medieval thing to do. The truce was also a time of diplomatic intrigue. The French, in a move that seems a bit like a modern-day political chess game, tried to use marriage to their advantage. They offered to marry the English king, Henry VI, to a French princess. The idea was to create a lasting peace and to finally put an end to the long, grinding war. The English agreed, and in 1445, Henry VI was married to Margaret of Anjou, a beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely determined French princess. The marriage was supposed to be a symbol of a new era of peace, but it was, in fact, a source of new problems. Margaret was a strong-willed woman who had her own ideas about how the English government should be run, and she quickly became a powerful figure in the English court. This, of course, led to even more resentment and political infighting among the English nobility. As the truce drew to a close, the French were ready. They had a professional army, a strong leader in Charles VII, and a newly unified kingdom. The English, on the other hand, were in a state of chaos. Their treasury was empty, their king was weak, and their government was divided. The French, with their newly professional army, were now fighting a war that the English could no longer afford to win. The first major military action of this final phase of the war was the Battle of Formigny in 1450. This was a significant battle because it was the first time that the French had decisively defeated a major English force in a pitched battle since the start of the war. The English force at Formigny was a relatively small one, but it was a veteran army, a classic English fighting force of longbowmen and men-at-arms. The French, under the command of the Count of Clermont, had a much larger army, but they also had a new and powerful weapon, artillery. The French had been quietly modernizing their military, and their cannons and gunpowder weapons were now a major force to be reckoned with. The battle was a tactical and strategic masterpiece on the part of the French. The French cavalry, a force that had been so easily defeated at Crécy and Poitiers, was now used to brilliant effect. They outmaneuvered the English, and the French artillery, in a terrifying display of its power, simply decimated the English ranks. The English, who were used to winning with their longbows, were now outgunned and outmaneuvered. The victory at Formigny was a complete and utter rout for the English. Thousands of English soldiers were killed, and the French had won a major psychological victory. The longbow, which had been the symbol of English dominance for over a century, had finally been defeated by a new kind of warfare, a war of gunpowder and cannons. The English now knew that they could no longer rely on their old tactics to win the war. The French had caught up, and they had even surpassed them in some ways. This was a clear sign that the war was now a lost cause for the English, a final confirmation that their long, grinding effort to conquer France had been a complete and utter failure. The French, meanwhile, had won a huge victory that was a clear sign that their long and patient comeback was about to be complete. The final act of the war, the slow and steady retaking of the last English strongholds, was about to begin. The long, bloody saga of the 100 Years' War was finally nearing its end. The French victory at Formigny was a major sign that the tide of the war had shifted for good, but the English still held a number of key territories, most importantly, the entire region of Gascony in southwestern France. This area had been a part of the English crown for centuries, a legacy of the marriage of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and its people had a long-standing loyalty to the English monarchy. But now, with a unified and professional French army on the march, the English had to face the reality that their vast French empire was about to disappear. The French king, Charles VII, a man who had now shed his former image as the King of Bourges, was a very different kind of leader. He was not a charismatic warrior like Henry V's or a chivalrous knight like his father. He was, in a very modern sense, a chief executive. He was a master of logistics and strategy, and he was determined to win the war with patience and efficiency. He didn't rush his campaigns. He would methodically lay siege to a city, use his newly developed artillery to breach its walls, and then move on to the next one. This was a war of science and engineering, not just of courage and steel. The English garrisons, who were often isolated and cut off from reinforcements, were simply unable to hold on. In 1451, a French army under the command of Jean de Dunois, one of the heroes of Orleans, marched into Gascony. They laid siege to the city of Bordeaux, the capital of the region. The English, in a state of chaos and disorganization, were unable to send a major relief force. The people of Bordeaux, who had been loyal to the English for so long, were now in a very difficult position. They had no support from England, and they were facing a powerful French army. They finally surrendered, and with its fall, the entire region of Gascony was now under French control. The English, in a last desperate attempt to hold on to their legacy, launched a final expedition to retake Gascony. This force was led by the legendary John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, a man who was one of the last great English commanders of the war. He was a veteran of the long, grinding conflict, a man who was, in many ways, a living symbol of the English dominance of the past. He was now in his late 60s, but he was still a formidable warrior. He and his army landed in Gascony in 1452, and the people of Bordeaux, who had been unhappy with the new French rule, welcomed them back with open arms. It seemed as if the long, bloody war might have one more final, dramatic turn. But the French were not caught off guard. They knew that the English would try to retake the region, and they were ready for them. The two forces finally came to a confrontation at the Battle of Castillon in 1453. This was to be the final major battle of the 100 Years' War, and it was, in many ways, a microcosm of the entire conflict. The English, under Talbot, were an army of the past. They were a force of chivalrous knights and longbowmen. The French, under the command of Jean Bureau, were an army of the future. They were a force of professional soldiers who were masters of artillery and siege warfare. The French had a massive artillery park with dozens of cannons and other gunpowder weapons. They had set up a formidable defensive position in a fortified camp, and they were ready for the English. Talbot, in his eagerness to engage the French, made a critical mistake. He launched a direct assault on the French camp, a classic medieval charge, but he was completely unprepared for the kind of firepower he was about to face. The French artillery simply decimated the English ranks, and Talbot himself was killed in the battle. The English army was completely routed, and with its defeat, the last English resistance in Gascony came to an end. The defeat at Castillon was not just a military loss. It was a final, undeniable sign that the war was over and that the French had won. The long, drawn-out saga of the 100 Years' War had finally and very definitively come to a close. The French victory at Castillon in 1453 was, for all intents and purposes, the end of the 100 Years' War. The English, in a state of chaos at home, were unable to raise another army to retake the lost territories. They had lost their last stronghold in France, and their dream of a dual monarchy was now a forgotten fantasy. The final surrender of the English forces in Bordeaux and other small garrisons marked a final and very definitive end to the long, bloody conflict. The war, which had begun with a king's claim to a throne, was now over, and the outcome was clear. France had won, and the English were now and forevermore a kingdom confined to its island borders. The English, however, never formally gave up their claim to the French throne. The English monarchs would continue to use the title King of France in their official documents and on their coins for centuries, a bit like a nostalgic memento of a glorious but long-lost past. It wasn't until the reign of King George III in 1801, more than 350 years later, that the title was finally dropped. This lingering claim was a clear sign that the war, for the English, was less about a single conflict and more about a deeply ingrained sense of historical right and national honor. The end of the war was a very different kind of event for the French. It was not a glorious, decisive final battle like Agincourt. It was a slow, methodical process of reclamation, a testament to the power of a strong, centralized government and professional army. King Charles VII, who had started the war as the King of Bourges and ended it as the victor, was not a flashy or charismatic hero. He was, in many ways, a modern king, a man who had won the war through patience, strategic planning, and a deep understanding of finance and military reform. He had not only unified his kingdom politically, but had also laid the groundwork for a new kind of French state, a more centralized and powerful monarchy that would define the nation's identity for centuries to come. The French, for their part, now had a new sense of national identity. They were no longer a collection of squabbling feudal lords. They were a nation, a single people united under a single king. The long, bloody conflict had forged a new French identity, a sense of unity and purpose that had not existed before the war. But the end of the war did not bring immediate peace to either nation. The English, who had been struggling with internal problems for decades, now descended into a civil war of their own, the Wars of the Roses. This conflict was a brutal and bloody struggle for the English throne between two rival branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. It was a war of noble families and private armies, a conflict that was in many ways a continuation of the chaos and violence of the 100 Years' War, only now it was being fought on English soil. The French, who had been so united by the war, now found themselves in a period of rebuilding. The country was in ruins. The population had been decimated by both war and plague, and the economy was in a shambles. The French king had to spend the rest of his reign and his successor's reign rebuilding his kingdom, a long and difficult process that would take decades. The legacy of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had lasted for more than a century, was profound. It had transformed both nations, politically, socially, and militarily. It had created a new kind of warfare, a war of professional armies and gunpowder weapons, and it had shown that the age of the chivalrous knight was coming to an end. It had forged a new sense of national identity for both the English and the French, a sense of who they were as a people and a sense of their place in the world. The war, for all its bloodshed and tragedy, had changed Europe forever, and it had set the stage for the rise of the modern nation-state. The end of the 100 Years' War brought a profound and lasting shift to the political landscape of both France and England. For England, the loss of its vast continental empire had a number of far-reaching consequences. For centuries, the English kings had been, in a very real sense, more French than English. They had spoken French, they had held vast French lands, and their main focus had been on the continent, not on their island kingdom. Now, with the loss of all their French territories, with the sole exception of Calais, the English monarchy was forced to look inward. The defeat, while humiliating, ultimately led to the consolidation of a more distinctly English identity. The English language, which had been relegated to a secondary status in the royal court for centuries, now became the dominant language of government and law. The English kings, with their focus now on their own island, began to build a more powerful and centralized state. This was a slow process, but it was a direct result of the war's conclusion. However, the end of the war did not bring immediate peace to England. The return of thousands of unemployed soldiers and the deeply divided nobility who had been on different sides of the French conflict led to a new and even more brutal civil war. The Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York, was in many ways a direct consequence of the 100 Years' War. The English nobles, who had been fighting in France for decades, now brought their private armies and their violent feuds home. The war was a brutal and bloody conflict that would last for 3 decades and would tear the country apart. It was a clear sign that the war, for all its grand ambitions, had left England in a state of chaos and internal strife. France, on the other hand, emerged from the war as a much stronger and more unified nation. King Charles VII, who had won the war through patience and strategic reforms, was a very different kind of monarch. He had laid the groundwork for a new kind of state, one that was no longer a collection of feudal lords, but a powerful, centralized kingdom with a professional army and a reliable source of income. The war had, in a sense, forced the French to grow up. It had forged a new national identity, a sense of unity and purpose that had been missing before the conflict. The French now saw themselves as a single people, a nation, and not just a collection of different regions. The war also had a profound effect on the French monarchy. The king, who had been so weak and powerless at the beginning of the war, was now a symbol of national victory and a source of immense authority. The French kings would, from now on, be much more powerful than their English counterparts. The war also had a significant impact on military technology and tactics. The longbow, which had been so dominant for so long, had finally been surpassed by the new technology of gunpowder weapons. The French, who had been so quick to adopt and develop artillery, now had a decisive advantage. The Battle of Castillon, where the English were completely routed by French cannons, was a clear sign that the age of the heavily armored knight and the longbow was over. A new age of professional armies, cannons, and fortifications was now beginning. This new kind of warfare was much more expensive, and only a strong, centralized state with a reliable source of income could afford to fight it. This, of course, gave the French, with their newly reformed state, a huge advantage in the coming centuries. The 100 Years' War, in its long, grinding, and often contradictory way, had been a crucible for both nations. It had broken England's long-standing connection to the continent and had forced it to become a more unified island nation. It had, in a much more dramatic way, forged a new, more powerful French state and a new French national identity. The war was a kind of tragic, bloody, and drawn-out birth of the modern nation-state, a long and painful process that would change Europe forever. The long, drawn-out saga of the war was finally over, but its legacy would linger for centuries in the language, the laws, and the national identities of both England and France. The end of the 100 Years' War brought a strange kind of quiet to Europe, a quiet that was soon filled with the sound of new conflicts. For England, the defeat in France led almost immediately to a period of intense internal strife. The nobility, who had been fighting each other and the French for over a century, now turned their attention to the English throne. The weak and ineffective king, Henry II, was no match for the ambition of his own cousins, and the long, drawn-out Wars of the Roses began. This was a brutal and bloody civil war, a conflict between two rival branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The war was fought for control of the English crown, and it was, in many ways, a direct result of the 100 Years' War. The nobles, who had grown powerful and wealthy from fighting in France, now had private armies and a taste for combat. The war in France had given them the experience and the military power to challenge the king, and they did so with a ferocity that was shocking even by the brutal standards of the medieval world. The Wars of the Roses were a very different kind of war from the 100 Years' War. They were not fought over vast territories in France, but over a small island kingdom. They were not fought with professional armies, but with private militias led by powerful nobles. The battles were often more chaotic and more brutal, with a high death toll among the nobility. The conflict would drag on for decades, and it would leave the English monarchy in a state of chaos and uncertainty. The English, who had been so united in their ambition to conquer France, were now tearing themselves apart. The loss of their French Empire was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological and political one, and it would have a profound and lasting effect on the nation for centuries to come. The long, bloody saga of the 100 Years' War had ended, but its legacy of violence and division would live on in England for a very long time. For France, the end of the war was a time of rebuilding and consolidation. King Charles VII, who had won the war, was now a king in a very different kind of kingdom. He had a powerful, centralized government, a professional army, and a loyal population. He no longer had to deal with the constant threat of an English invasion, and he was able to turn his attention to internal matters. He spent the rest of his reign and his sons rebuilding the country. The war had left a deep scar on the French landscape. Towns and villages had been burned, the population had been decimated, and the economy was in a shambles. The kings of France had a long and difficult task ahead of them, but they were now in a much stronger position to do so. The war had also had a profound effect on the French monarchy. The king, who had been so weak at the beginning of the war, was now a symbol of national victory and a source of immense authority. The French kings would, from now on, be much more powerful than their English counterparts. The 100 Years' War had also changed the relationship between the king and the nobility in both countries. In England, the king's power was weakened by the war, and the nobility, who had grown powerful from their private armies and their lands in France, were now in a position to challenge him. In France, the king's power was strengthened by the war. He had created a professional army that was loyal to him, not to the individual lords, and he had a new, reliable source of income. This allowed him to consolidate his power and to create a more centralized state. The war, in a very real and very tragic way, had created two very different kinds of nations. One was a powerful, centralized state with an all-powerful monarchy, and the other was a nation that was about to be torn apart by a long and bloody civil war. The long, drawn-out saga of the 100 Years' War was over, but its legacy would linger for centuries in the language, the laws, and the national identities of both England and France. The end of the 100 Years' War brought a fundamental change to the way that wars were fought. For over a century, the battlefield had been dominated by the heavily armored knight and the English longbowman. The war was, in many ways, a testament to the power of a disciplined force of infantry and archers to defeat a more numerous but less organized force of cavalry. The victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were all clear signs that the age of chivalry, with its focus on one-on-one combat and glorious charges, was coming to an end. But the final phase of the war saw the rise of a new and even more dominant technology: gunpowder. The French, under the leadership of King Charles VII and his skilled artillery commander, Jean Bureau, had been quietly developing and perfecting the use of cannons. The Battle of Castillon in 1453 was the first major battle in European history where cannons were the decisive factor in the victory. The English, in their final desperate charge, were simply mowed down by French artillery, and the age of the longbow was over. The shift to gunpowder warfare had a profound effect on the nature of war itself. Cannons were incredibly expensive to build and operate, and they required a large number of skilled engineers and gunners to use them effectively. This meant that only a powerful, centralized state with a reliable source of income could afford to fight a war. This gave a huge advantage to the French king, who had just created a new, professional army and a centralized tax system. The English, on the other hand, with their weak king and their empty treasury, were unable to compete. The war had, in a very real way, transformed the art of war from a matter of individual courage and skill to a matter of finance and technology. The war also had a profound effect on the concept of the nation. For over a century, the English and French had been fighting over a king's claim to a throne. But by the end of the war, the conflict had become something much more. It had become a struggle for the very identity of both nations. The English, in their fight to hold on to their French empire, had become a more unified and distinctly English people. They had a new sense of national pride and a new sense of their place in the world. The French, in their long and bloody struggle to drive the English out, had also forged a new national identity. They were no longer just a collection of different regions and different loyalties. They were a single people, a nation, and they were united under a single king. The long, drawn-out saga of the 100 Years' War was a kind of tragic, bloody birth of the modern nation-state. The end of the war also had a significant impact on the nobility of both countries. In France, the nobility, who had been so divided by their civil war and their private feuds, were now brought under the control of a powerful, centralized monarchy. The king, with his new professional army, was now the ultimate authority in the land, and the nobles no longer had the power to challenge him. In England, the opposite was true. The long, grinding war had left the nobility with private armies and a taste for combat. This would lead to the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that would tear the country apart. The war had, in a very real way, created two very different kinds of nations. One was a powerful, centralized state with an all-powerful monarchy, and the other was a nation that was about to be torn apart by a long and bloody civil war. The long, drawn-out saga of the 100 Years' War was over, but its legacy would linger for centuries in the language, the laws, and the national identities of both England and France. The end of the 100 Years' War brought a fundamental change to the way that kings and their people saw themselves. For over a century, the conflict had been a long, drawn-out affair fought by powerful noble families and their private armies. But the war had also led to the rise of a new kind of state, one that was more centralized and more powerful. This was especially true in France, where the king, Charles VII, had created a professional army that was loyal to him, not to the individual lords. He had also created a new, reliable source of income through a centralized tax system. This gave him the financial and military power to rule his kingdom without having to constantly rely on the support of his nobles. This new kind of state, with its powerful monarch and its professional army, was a direct threat to the old feudal system, which was based on the idea of a king as a first among equals who had to constantly negotiate with his powerful noble lords. In France, the king's power was now absolute, and the nobles, who had been so powerful at the beginning of the war, were now little more than civil servants who had to obey the king's commands. This was a huge change, and it was a direct result of the long, bloody conflict. The war had, in a sense, forced the French to grow up and to create a new kind of political system. The war also had a profound effect on the concept of the nation. For over a century, the English and French had been fighting over a king's claim to a throne. But by the end of the war, the conflict had become something much more. It had become a struggle for the very identity of both nations. The English, in their fight to hold on to their French empire, had become a more unified and distinctly English people. They had a new sense of national pride and a new sense of their place in the world. The French, in their long and bloody struggle to drive the English out, had also forged a new national identity. They were no longer just a collection of different regions and different loyalties. They were a single people, a nation, and they were united under a single king. The long, drawn-out saga of the 100 Years' War was a kind of tragic, bloody birth of the modern nation-state. The end of the war also had a significant impact on the nobility of both countries. In France, the nobility, who had been so divided by their civil war and their private feuds, were now brought under the control of a powerful, centralized monarchy. The king, with his new professional army, was now the ultimate authority in the land, and the nobles no longer had the power to challenge him. In England, the opposite was true. The long, grinding war had left the nobility with private armies and a taste for combat. This would lead to the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that would tear the country apart. The war had, in a very real way, created two very different kinds of nations. One was a powerful, centralized state with an all-powerful monarchy, and the other was a nation that was about to be torn apart by a long and bloody civil war. The war had also led to a number of social and economic changes. The constant need for money to pay for the war had led to the rise of a new kind of financial system, one that was based on taxation and loans. The English Parliament, in particular, had grown in power because the king had to constantly ask for money to pay for the war. This gave the Parliament a great deal of leverage, and it was a clear sign that the king's power was not absolute. In France, the king had created a new, centralized tax system, which gave him the financial power to rule his kingdom without having to constantly rely on the support of his nobles. The war had, in a very real way, changed the relationship between the king, the nobility, and the common people in both countries. The end of the 100 Years' War brought a fundamental change to the way that kings and their people saw themselves. For over a century, the conflict had been a long, drawn-out affair fought by powerful noble families and their private armies. But the war had also led to the rise of a new kind of state, one that was more centralized and more powerful. This was especially true in France, where the king, Charles VII, had created a professional army that was loyal to him, not to the individual lords. He had also created a new, reliable source of income through a centralized tax system. This gave him the financial and military power to rule his kingdom without having to constantly rely on the support of his nobles. This new kind of state, with its powerful monarch and its professional army, was a direct threat to the old feudal system, which was based on the idea of a king as a first among equals who had to constantly negotiate with his powerful noble lords. In France, the king's power was now absolute, and the nobles, who had been so powerful at the beginning of the war, were now little more than civil servants who had to obey the king's commands. This was a huge change, and it was a direct result of the long, bloody conflict. The war had, in a sense, forced the French to grow up and to create a new kind of political system. The war also had a profound effect on the concept of the nation. For over a century, the English and French had been fighting over a king's claim to a throne, but by the end of the war, the conflict had become something much more. It had become a struggle for the very identity of both nations. The English, in their fight to hold on to their French empire, had become a more unified and distinctly English people. They had a new sense of national pride and a new sense of their place in the world. The French, in their long and bloody struggle to drive the English out, had also forged a new national identity. They were no longer just a collection of different regions and different loyalties. They were a single people, a nation, and they were united under a single king. The long, drawn-out saga of the 100 Years' War was a kind of tragic, bloody birth of the modern nation-state. The end of the war also had a significant impact on the nobility of both countries. In France, the nobility, who had been so divided by their civil war and their private feuds, were now brought under the control of a powerful, centralized monarchy. The king, with his new professional army, was now the ultimate authority in the land, and the nobles no longer had the power to challenge him. In England, the opposite was true. The long, grinding war had left the nobility with private armies and a taste for combat. This would lead to the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that would tear the country apart. The war had, in a very real way, created two very different kinds of nations. One was a powerful, centralized state with an all-powerful monarchy, and the other was a nation that was about to be torn apart by a long and bloody civil war. The war had also led to a number of social and economic changes. The constant need for money to pay for the war had led to the rise of a new kind of financial system, one that was based on taxation and loans. The English Parliament, in particular, had grown in power because the king had to constantly ask for money to pay for the war. This gave the Parliament a great deal of leverage, and it was a clear sign that the king's power was not absolute. In France, the king had created a new, centralized tax system, which gave him the financial power to rule his kingdom without having to constantly rely on the support of his nobles. The war had, in a very real way, changed the relationship between the king, the nobility, and the common people in both countries.